So in part 1 of the series, I talked a lot about how contemporary films use cinematic grammar to frame bad dads as flawed but ultimately loving. Let's take a look at a movie that acknowledges the unloving, abusive nature of a tyrannical patriarch and contextualize it more honestly. Star Trek II.
Darkness is coming.
No, not that Star Trek II. The other Star Trek II. Back in an episode of the original series, Captain Kirk marooned his enemy Khan on a remote planet, Ceti Alpha 5. Then, between the events of that episode and the second Star Trek movie, another nearby planet exploded, resulting in the death of much of Khan's crew. Khan's wife, Marla McGivers, was among those who died on Ceti Alpha 5. Khan blames Kirk for her death, which at first seems like a typical "you killed my wife" motivation. Khan uses his wife's death as the justification to try and kill Kirk and take his ship.
I shall leave you as you left me, as you left her.
But this murdered wife motivation is not your typical paint-by-number studio decision. See, the reason Kirk marooned Khan in the first place is because back in the original series episode, Khan tried to kill Kirk and take his ship.
Your ship is mine. I have shut off the life support system to your bridge.
That's what Khan does. It's like his thing. He tries to kill people and take their stuff. His desire comes first, his justification is secondary. Khan doesn't form relationships because he cares about people. He forms them to use people, even after their death.
These people had sworn to live and die at my command 200 years before you were born.
One of Khan's crew, Joaquin, tries to convince Khan to flee after they've captured the Genesis device.
Full impulse power.
No, sir! You have Genesis! You can have whatever you... Full power! Thank you!
But even when Khan possesses Genesis, a scientific instrument whose purpose is literally to create life, he's still focused on destruction. He refuses to listen to constructive criticism, and then, even at their moment of defeat, Khan, the leader, the patriarch, the daddy, and Joaquin, the follower, the subject, the son, are both unable to imagine that they were wrong. Here's Joaquin's last words.
Yours is superior.
He was trying to say, one last time, yours is a superior intellect. Joaquin has watched his master objectively fail, but to him that is not failure, because in Joaquin's mind, Khan is incapable of failure. It's merely an opportunity to repeat their slogan of racial superiority. Khan, likewise, immediately uses Joaquin's death as an excuse to justify revenge once again.
I shall avenge you.
Khan wants to believe that he's the victim, that he's been wronged. Some people are extremely resistant or maybe even incapable of personal growth. Some people will never pivot to become presidential. And despite his supposed superiority, Khan will never evolve a sense of humanity.
I'm laughing at the superior intellect.
I glossed over this earlier, but Khan's wife Marla wasn't killed in the explosion. She was killed by a little bug.
They killed 20 of my people, including my beloved wife.
Khan could have waged war against these tiny bugs for killing his wife, but he keeps them as pets and continues to wage war against Kirk because he doesn't actually love his wife or crew. He loves revenge. He even seems to respect the bugs. Their larvae burrow into your ear and allow someone else to control your mind.
This has the effect of rendering the victim extremely susceptible to suggestion.
A perfect metaphor for a big bad daddy who just wants you to do as he commands. Early on, we get a glimpse of Khan's bookshelf. Moby Dick, King Lear, Paradise Lost, Ahab, Lear, and Satan are all characters we're meant to read as horribly misguided. They are irrational, lacking in compassion, and lacking in humanity. But to Khan, they are idols and heroes. They pursued their fanatical goals until they destroy everything around them. Thanos and Khan are similar characters in many ways. They both mask their selfishness and ideology. They both assume their own superior intellect and morality, regardless of the violence they cause. The difference between Thanos and Khan is the filmmakers of Infinity War construct Thanos to try to make us empathize with him. Conversely, the filmmakers of Wrath of Khan are more interested in illuminating the hypocrisy of unquestionable leadership. I can imagine this movie getting remade, which it did, and a studio being like, we need to humanize this character. which they did, and suddenly you're casting a more charismatic actor for your villain than your hero. I mean, who doesn't like Benedict Cumberbatch? This trend of humanizing the genocidal maniac is pretty unsettling, and I would argue that it originates in narratives written around the time the Hays Codes were abandoned, when filmmakers started to experiment more and more with narratives that featured outsiders, whether they were non-traditional heroes, anti-heroes, or straight-up criminals, like 1967's Bonnie and Clyde. However, these mid to late 20th century narratives usually featured someone who was conventionally considered outside the bounds of civilized society. Bank robbers.
If they move, kill them.
Young people experimenting with sexuality.
We'd be good together.
I'm dating your best friend.
He won't mind.
Drug dealers. Or people in trans relationships.
7 bridesmaids, all male, Sonny's mother, and about 70 other guests, all members of the gay community, were present. We've been able to obtain a still photograph of Leon in his gown.
These movies questioned authority by humanizing characters who were prosecuted, persecuted, or oppressed by that authority. However, as mainstream Hollywood has co-opted these outsider narratives, we see humanizing traits applied to genocidal murderers like Thanos in an attempt to make us feel sympathetic for the prosecutor, the persecutor, and the oppressor. So connecting this all back to reality, we can either sympathize with and humanize a genocidal dictator, or we can abolish ICE. Speaking of Star Trek, I think we can all agree that Star Wars has a lot to do with the current pop culture obsession with dad stories, since the original trilogy had an unprecedented cultural impact. However, unlike a lot of other movies that sentimentalize relationships with daddies, the original trilogy questioned those relationships. Darth Vader personifies the fear that we will grow to make the same mistakes as our parents. As the original trilogy progresses, Luke must confront the evil within himself in order to defeat it. At first, Luke denies the possibility that he could ever end up like his father.
Luke, I don't want to lose you to the Emperor the way I lost Vader.
You won't.
It's like, of course I'll never end up as a cyborg villain.
I'll never join you!
But immediately after that confrontation, Luke is fitted with a cyborg hand. He's in danger of being taken over by the machine. And his mechanical hand is a great metaphor, because the machine just does what it's told.
Yes, my master.
Vader wants a son who will just do as he's told. I know Return of the Jedi gets a lot of crap for being silly or a mess, but in one of the most anticipated action-adventure sci-fi films of all time, how does this intergalactic space drama about war and evil end? With an act of non-violence.
Fulfill your destiny and take your father's place at my side.
Never. I'll never turn to the dark side.
Luke refuses to perpetuate his father's cycle of violence. And only at the end of all 3 films do we finally see Vader's humanity restored when he sacrifices himself to save his son. And it's not a one-sided relationship. Luke and Vader both sacrifice something. What was once a hierarchy becomes an equal, healthy relationship.
I'll not leave you here. I've got to save you.
You already have.
Luke and Vader are each willing in the end to sacrifice themselves to save the other. Unlike a daddy who pushes his daughter off a cliff so he can get what he wants. Sacrifice would be putting himself in harm's way. Aside from Vader, there are a lot of flawed daddies in Star Wars. There are even fairly good daddies like Luke's foster father Lars, Obi-Wan, and Yoda. But Star Wars still complicates those surrogate father figures by showing them mislead Luke in pursuit of what they think is right.
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
A certain point of view?
George Lucas was very much part of the hippie counterculture.
Remember, never trust anybody over 30.
Episode 4, A New Hope, was a product of the Nixon, maybe our leader daddies are bad daddies generation. That's why it's fascinating to see what he did with the father archetype 20 years later. When he made the prequels, he was in a very different part of his life. By 1999, he was a father himself. And a billionaire. So instead of another interesting commentary on parent-child relationships, we end up with an immaculately conceived main character.
Who was his father?
There was no father.
Which is completely unrelatable to any human being living on Earth. Whereas Lucas seemed afraid or unwilling to confront those issues in the prequels, Rian Johnson tackles them head-on in The Last Jedi. Luke is a rare example of a father figure who we know and love, admitting that he failed.
I failed because I was Luke Skywalker, Jedi Master. A legend.
Luke failed because he bought into the Jedi power hierarchy. In the beginning of The Last Jedi, Luke tries to control his students, forcing them to adhere to the light side. He refuses to teach Rey, exerting control over her by preventing her from learning. And obviously he pulled a lightsaber on Kylo. But over the course of the film, he learns that a parent or teacher's role is not to control.
You failed him by thinking his choice was made. It wasn't. There's still conflict in him.
Instead, his role is to prepare others to face their own challenges.
We are what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters.
In the flashback where Luke is tempted to control Kylo, the visuals emphasize Luke's cybernetic hand, calling back to Vader's desire to control Luke. Even though Vader is long dead, Luke is still in danger of making the same mistakes as his father, of becoming his father.
And the last thing I saw were the eyes of a frightened boy whose master had failed him.
Kylo saw the terrifying reality that Luke, one of his biggest father figures, was flawed, just another human. Kylo was so desperate for authoritarian validation, aka a daddy, for someone to tell him what to do, for a set of hardline rules to live by. Kylo's view of the universe requires that his master be unquestionably powerful and perfect, because that's what he's desperately trying to convince himself that he is. The final lightsaber duel between Kylo and Luke is the perfect metaphor for an angry little boy sitting at his computer, throwing a tantrum at someone's online avatar. Similar to Kylo, Rey looks to Luke to show her the way.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
But unlike Kylo, who turns to Snoke at the first sign of Luke's weakness, Rey forgives Luke and gives him the opportunity to redeem himself. Rogue One gets some things really right. Seeing a bunch of burly commandos stand in front of Jyn and openly admit that they've done terrible things in the name of good and that they want to atone for their sins is awesome.
We've all done terrible things on behalf of the rebellion.
But in the end, it falls short. In fact, the story's unflinching devotion to the father ends up ruining Jyn's character arc in an otherwise pretty great movie. Jyn's father is portrayed as a scientist who is coerced into constructing the Death Star. We're told that without him, it wouldn't get built. But the movie also performs feats of emotional and moral gymnastics to show how conflicted he is about it. That he really doesn't want to do it, that he has to, or else. So while his words contradict his actions, he's more than just complicit. He should have been the Darth Vader of Jyn's story. But even at the end of her narrative, she's ultimately finishing his work.
It must be destroyed.
I know. We will.
She doesn't possess the agency of a true protagonist. Instead of breaking free of that paternalistic hierarchy, she exists to serve the father.
My heart belongs to my daddy. Da 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 da.
Khan is the kind of daddy who tries to create a closed society where all power flows from him and him alone. He's inflexible. He's also set in his ways, unable to adapt as the world progresses around him.
He's intelligent, but not experienced. His pattern indicates two-dimensional thinking.
Like Thanos, Jonathan Kent, and Jor-El, Khan's worldview is static. His morality doesn't evolve with the times. They avoid difficult life lessons, instead relying on extremely vague morality or platitudes.
It was only the fact of my genetically engineered intellect that allowed us to survive.
Or being so specific that they end up being unhelpful. These dads are the kind of guys who would, say, give you a list of 12 rules to follow, which include things as mundane as clean your room, or as irrelevant as don't bother children while they're skateboarding, or even reinforcing parental authority by stating, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Even Yoda engaged in this kind of rule-based thinking at one point.
He is too old. Yes, too old to begin the training.
Yoda only uses rules in his attempt to avoid doing what he's afraid to do. Train Luke. Yoda resorts to rules out of fear of failure, fear of what could happen if Luke is empowered to make his own decisions. That's not to say all rules are bad, but we need to understand how and why the rules we follow were established. Do these rules exist to help us live fuller lives or to restrict us?
My heart belongs to Daddy.
Like The Last Jedi, a few recent big-budget movies have started to do a better job of challenging parental authority.
All of you are wrong!
At least as much as they can within a studio system. But I do hope that these movies represent a step towards a more progressive genre of daddy fiction. As little kids sitting in a theater, movies shape how we view reality. And adults aren't immune from that influence either. We've gotten back to back movies where daddies and authority are glorified. When writers and directors dress up pro-authority messages as fantastical, hyper-stylized action spectacles, kids may internalize harmful relationships which movies justify as loving. And adults are given really problematic examples of parenting. It's one thing for Thanos to tell everyone, I love my daughter who I abuse all the time, if the point is that we as an audience are given the space to think, no, that's not a loving father. It's another thing entirely for the Marvel Universe to confirm that he does, in fact, love her by rewarding him when he pushes His power is to manipulate other people's will, similar to the bugs in Wrath of Khan, or the dark side of the Force in Star Wars. But even without the ring, characters manipulate one another throughout the entire story. Over and over, we see daddies trying to bend their children to their own will. Hereditary status is like a sick obsession with most of these characters. Elrond tries to tell Erwin that she can't date humans. Theoden tries to tell Eowyn that she can't fight because she's no man. Denethor tries to burn his son alive because he's got this whole inferiority complex about not being the actual king daddy of Gondor. Each one of these children rebels and chooses their own path. Well, not Faramir, he doesn't choose to be flame retardant. But curiously, Frodo, the bearer of the ring, who shoulders the heaviest weight of the quest, doesn't have a strong parental relationship in the narrative. Sure, Bilbo adopted him, but Bilbo never acts in a way we describe as fatherly. Frodo comes from this massive extended family in the Shire, and yet, when the question arises who will carry the ring, no one is there to pressure Frodo into accepting it. All the other members of the council squabble over hereditary feuds passed down for generations and call out each other's daddies.
Long has my father, the steward of Gondor, kept the forces of Mordor at bay.
The One Ring answers to Sauron alone. It has no other master.
He is Aragorn, son of Arathorn.
This is Isildur's heir.
The ring cannot be destroyed, Gimli, son of Gloin, by any craft that we here possess.
I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf! So much
In contrast, Frodo makes the choice himself, without ulterior motive. This is why he's the best choice to carry the ring. Even Aragorn and Gandalf, our most noble sword and magic-wielding heroes, know they must not take the ring. They're too entrenched in paternalistic power structures. And later, Boromir tries to steal the ring, because he's just gotta prove to Daddy that he's the best boy. With every line Boromir speaks, you can imagine his dad yelling that same crap at him when he was a kid.
I cannot.
A ring is a closed circle, a symbol of restrictive order. It can be a sign that you belong to another person. A ring is also very often a family heirloom. And since the greatest power of the One Ring is that it can bend another being to your will, it is the physical manifestation of an abusive parent telling their child, just do what I say. The One Ring, more than anything else, is a concrete symbol of the authoritarian nature of the patriarchy. So yeah, let's toss that shit into the fires of Mount Doom. But hey, you don't have to do what I tell you. After all, I'm not your daddy. Or am I?
My heart belongs to my daddy.
Thanks for watching, and a big thank you to all my patrons who help make it possible for me to make more of these videos more often. If you'd like to support too, head over to patreon.com/MaggieMayFish and leave a comment here or on Twitter. Plus, look out for my upcoming podcast about friendship called My Top 8, coming soon on the Small Beans Podcast Network. And as always, save Martha.